Hi everyone, this is my Module 2 discussion responses. So for Chapter 2, my first question was name 3 reasons why nonverbal communication is important. Evaluate and discuss your own nonverbal communication awareness. Are you fairly attentive to nonverbal communication, or is this stuff new to you? Work through a personal example of a time when you needed to improve your verbal or nonverbal communication. What changes would you have made in the situation? What do you think our authors would say about your example? So, my 3 reasons that nonverbal communication is so important are over half of the communication we are involved in is nonverbal. So, like facial expressions, gestures, things like that. Second, it expresses emotions that we can't or don't want to express verbally. And third, it aids in the perception of verbal communication. I'm usually pretty aware of my nonverbal communication. One thing that I do struggle with, though, is facial expressions, so I've been trying to make sure I look more interested or happier, because a lot of people say I have resting bitch face, pardon my language, but I've been trying to work on that a little bit, but everything else I'm usually pretty aware of. I'm also really aware of other people's nonverbal communication. So, for example, my mom, she tends to say she's fine when she's actually upset. So I can kind of see it. Usually I can really see it if she's actually upset and she's hiding it from me. One time that I needed to improve my verbal communication was when I started going to church on a regular basis. I was used to swearing without worrying about what others thought. So going to church meant that I needed to rein in the cursing and start finding substitutes for certain words. It was difficult for a while, and I still struggle with it sometimes, but not nearly as much as I used to when I was in high school. Second question I chose was step back and reflect on a time when you received criticism at work or school. How did you respond verbally? How did you respond non-verbally? How did the environment contribute to your communication? How would the authors interpret your example? Use and cite the text in your response. The best example that I can think of would be when I was taking my driving test recently to get my driver's license. Yeah, I know, crazy. I'm 20 years old and I don't have a driver's license. Still don't, as you'll find out in the story. So I thought I was doing really good, and I did everything perfectly, but the instructor had me go back to the driving school and told me I failed. Surprise, I had no idea why I failed. I was upset because I didn't think I had done what she said I did, so internally I was really upset, and I'm really sensitive to things like criticism, not as much as I used to be, but I was just really upset and I was stressed out. I was leaving on a trip in the next few days, so I really felt like I was going to cry for no reason, but I couldn't exactly cry or get angry in front of her because it would just make the situation worse. So I just stayed really quiet and nodded along with what she was trying to say. So my nonverbal communication, I probably had tears in my eyes and I was nodding along, and I didn't really have any verbal communication because I didn't really say anything to her. I think the fact that it was in an unfamiliar environment really didn't help the situation either. Not knowing her beforehand, I had never driven that car before, things like that, so I was already under stress before that. As for how the authors might interpret my example, I'm not really sure how to answer that. I mean, I think they would think of it as maybe a good example of needing to maybe work on my verbal and nonverbal communication in that situation. Okay, so for Chapter 3 questions, my first one I picked was, what is the difference between hearing and listening as presented and discussed in the text, and why does it matter? Be sure to use and cite the text in your response, even if you do not agree with it. So this is a big thing for me. I've always tried to explain to people that there's a difference between hearing and listening, and it took me a long time to figure that out, and I still struggle with it. I don't always listen very well. So hearing and listening are two entirely different things. Hearing is our ability to detect sounds, whereas listening requires effort and skill and paying attention and understanding what's going on. So when we listen to messages that we receive, we interpret them and decide what they mean, and then attempt to get feedback on if we were correct in our assumptions. According to the text on page 44, the ability to be an effective listener plays a role in one's business and professional communication and is prerequisite to demonstrating professional excellence. Listening is difficult, but it's necessary for there to ever be effective communication in both the workplace and in our personal lives. So finally, what is listening bias, and in what ways does it affect your communication interactions? What can you do to avoid it in future interactions? Use the text to help you respond to this question. So, listening bias, from my interpretation, is letting assumptions about a person or subject cloud our ability to listen to the message we are receiving and absorb the information properly. According to the text on page 50, bias may prevent you from listening to what the person has to say, and you may miss some important information. So, for example, if I was upset with my supervisor for something she said or something she did or whatever, and we go into a meeting and she's trying to explain like new procedures or anything like that, and I'm just so angry with her, I let it cloud the changes that are being made and I don't understand them, and then repercussions happen and I don't do what I'm supposed to do. One way we can avoid this is by putting our biases aside when we are required to listen and remaining neutral to the situation. It can help us absorb the information that we need, and we can return to our biases afterwards if it's really necessary. I just think it's really important to try and put your biases aside when you're trying to listen to somebody or absorb information, because if you're letting that cloud your judgment and your ability to pay attention, you're going to be the only one that suffers, not them. So anyway, that's all I've got. Thanks for listening. Hope you guys have a great week.